Node.js allows you to run JavaScript code outside the web browser. This makes it possible for you to translate your existing JavaScript skills from the front end and also use them on the back end. A lot of you might have had coding meetups canceled recently. I know my own coding meetup that I run here in Seattle had to be canceled this month. So let's do a virtual coding meetup together. We're going to go through some of Learn You Node, which is an open source interactive Node.js tutorial. We'll do that and figure out Node.js together. If you're here when this video premieres, I'm going to be in the chat, so feel free to ask me questions and I'll do the best I can to answer them. If you're watching this video later, post your questions in the comments and I'll circle back and reply to them there. Let's get started. Let's go to Node School. We're going to use this GitHub repo called Learn You Node. It says it is an intro to Node.js via a set of self-guided workshops. We're not going to pay any attention to that though. We're going to do them together. The first thing we need to do is we need to have Node installed. I'm not going to go through that on this screencast because I already have it installed and I think it's pretty straightforward. But if you need to install it, click on this link and you'll get this for whatever operating system you're running. I'm on Mac OS, so it's taken me the Mac OS download page. What I'm running, this 12.16.1, or roughly that version, something pretty close to that. That's not, as you can see, the most current version, but that's the long-term support version, which means version 12 of Node will continue to get security patches after they have already deprecated version 13. If you don't have Node, download one of the Node packages and install it on your system. The next thing we need to do is we need to run npm install -g learn you node. I'm going to start out by copying this command, and now I have to run this in my terminal, so I'm going to flip over to a terminal. If you're on Windows, you can do this in the command line, you can do it in PowerShell, you can do it in a terminal emulator like the Git bash that comes with Git when you install Git on Windows. And newer versions of Windows, I think Windows 10 now has a Linux subsystem you can install, and you can get a terminal emulator that way. That would work sort of like what I'm doing here on my Mac. On the Mac, you ship with terminal, and then I have downloaded and installed iTerm2, and that's what I'm using for my terminal emulator. Right now, I am inside my projects directory. By default, npm install and then the name of a package without this G option, this -G, would install the package just for that directory. So it would create a Node modules folder in that directory and install the package there. If you run npm install with -G, it installs the package globally. And what that will do is for a binary application like this, that means an application where I can just type a command into the command line and it runs, I can type that from anywhere and it will just run. Now that I've pasted that in, I'll press return and npm will do its thing, downloading the package and installing it for me. Okay, cool. This means it's done, plus Learn You Node at 4.2.1. That means we now have Learn You Node version 4.2.1 installed globally. The reason I am in my projects directory right now is because we are going to be writing some code to do these practice projects, and I want to put it all in one place where I can easily find it and keep it organized. So inside my projects directory, I'm going to make a new directory using mkdir and then space, and then I'm just going to call it Learn You Node. You don't have to make a directory through the terminal. You can do this through your command line in Windows. You can do it through Windows Explorer. If you want to do it through a graphical user interface like that. On the Mac, you can do it through Finder. You can do it anywhere you can manage files. Now that I have that directory, I'm going to switch into it. Okay, and I'm using Command K to clear the buffer so that I kind of get a clean slate here. Now this is just a new empty directory, and I'm ready to start running Learn You Node and running through the practice exercises. Another thing I want to have in place is I want to make sure I have some sort of editor because I'm going to be writing code. You can use whatever editor you like. If you don't have one that you are already using, I'd recommend installing Visual Studio Code. I am running it right now. This is not actually the code editor I use all the time, although I might end up switching to it. I've been using an editor called Spacemax, which is really cool and has some powerful features, but I don't necessarily recommend it for beginners because it's got a pretty steep learning curve. What I've done is I've added some extensions on to Visual Studio Code that will make it a little bit more familiar to me, coming from Spacemax. And I think I am going to just go with that. So I'll kind of be learning this along with you, but we should be just fine. Now I'm going to start Learn You Node, and you start it just by typing Learn You Node. If we hadn't installed it globally with that -G option, we would not be able to run it like this. It gives us a nice little menu, and these are all the different exercises it includes. We'll just start at the first one, Hello World. Okay, our exercise, create a file named hello-world.js. Write a program that prints the text hello world, all caps, to the console. Gives us a few hints. To make a Node.js program, create a new file with a .js extension and start writing JavaScript. Execute your program by running it with the node command. And here's an example of what that looks like. So the $sign represents the prompt. So that would be, for me, it would kind of be like all this. So after that, I'm going to type node and then a space and then hello-world.js, that being hello-world.js being the name of my file. And what that will do is that will start the node virtual machine, I guess, and it will load that file and execute the code in it. Oh, and then on the next line here, they have, here's how to write out text to the console. You do it in Node the same way you do in the browser, console.log, and then you pass in whatever string you want to write out. And then this is how we're going to verify that we've completed this exercise. Learn You Node, space, verify, space, and then the name of our file. That means I am ready to switch back over to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to open that new directory I created. It's in my projects directory, and it is Learn You Node. Okay, cool. This is our Explorer. It looks very empty because there are no files in that directory. So I'm going to go ahead and create one, and that's going to be hello-world.js. And now we've got our editor. I don't think I need the Explorer anymore. I like to have lots of room for my editor to breathe. And I'm going to flip back over and look at the directions again. I need to write a program that prints the text hello world to the console. Hello world all in caps. Okay. That's going to be pretty easy. Console.log, and then I need to pass in a string. So I'm going to open quotes and hello. Oh, I'm already screwing this up. Hello world. Okay. That should meet the requirements. Okay, let's save that file, flip back over, and let's try to run it ourselves first, with just directly through Node. So I'm going to type node hello world.js. Okay, looks like that did what we wanted. Let's see if learning node agrees. Great, this looks like a success. We got a big check mark. It ran one test. So what it's doing is it's comparing the actual output of our script against the expected output, and it says those are the same, so we passed. We're good. Your solution to Hello World passed. And here is the official solution, which looks pretty much identical to ours. That's the first exercise. I'm going to Command K to clear out my buffer just so I can start fresh. And I'm not sure, I think that may just be an iterm2 shortcut. So there's probably, yeah, it may be the same on terminal. Actually, let me look really quick. And then on Windows, of course, you don't have command, so it's going to be something else. Clear screen. Oh yeah, it's completely different on terminal as well. It is command, and I always forget, that's control, I think. Command Control L. Anyway, you can sort of sift through your menus and figure out what clears the screen if you want to try that yourself. Let's just start the menu again and go on to the second exercise, baby steps. Okay, this one has a little more to it. We're going to create a file named baby-steps, baby-steps.js. Write a program that accepts one or more numbers as command line arguments and prints the sum of those numbers to the console. Okay. In our hints, you can access command line arguments via the global process object. The process object has an argv property, which is an array containing the command line, the complete command line. So here's how we would get to that, process.argv. That would give us the complete command line. Okay, so ultimately what we're trying to do again is accept one or more numbers and print the sum. Okay, so back here on the hints, they're telling us you can try this to get started. So just log out process.argv, and if you do that and run it like this, passing in 1, 2, and 3, you're going to get out this, which looks like an array containing node, the path to your file, and then the arguments 1, 2, and 3. Let's switch over to the editor and go ahead and create this baby steps file. I'm doing Command N to give me a new file, and then the first thing I'm doing is saving it, Command S. And now I'm going to name it baby-steps.js. Okay, now I have my new file. If I want to look at it in the Explorer here, yeah, looks good. If you want to just create it this way, just hit the Explorer to bring it up and then hit your new file here. You can do that too. It doesn't make any difference. I like to do stuff with the keyboard as much as possible because that kind of keeps me a little more nimble, I think. All right, so what do I know? I know process.argv is going to give me all of my command line, well, everything that was typed to the command line, the arguments and everything else. And I only care about what comes after the script path, which will be the second argument, and all those are going to be numbers, or we hope. Oh, actually, this is interesting. So they've passed in numbers, but as you can tell here, the output are strings. So those numbers, when they get fed in through the command line argument, argv is storing them as strings. So one thing we're going to have to do is make them numbers again. The first thing I'm going to do is, okay. I'm going to say numbers. And I want to get, I don't want everything in here. I want everything from the third argument on. And actually it needs to be numbers, not number. Okay, but we're not done here. I think I can use, actually I'm not sure. If argv was an array, then I think I could use either slice, I think I could use slice to do that, but I'm not sure argv is an array. I'm just going to do a search here. Get arguments, Node.js. This is actually a little more in-depth than I want. This is pretty simple. I like this. Let's just steal that. Okay. That should do it. And that'll give me a constant numbers that's going to be an array of all of the number arguments. But they're not actually numbers yet. So maybe it makes sense to call this number strings, and then we can convert them to actual numbers. A lot of people would do this in one line, and I understand the desire to do it that way. I typically don't, because I like my code to be really readable. I like you to be able to see each step that I'm taking. That way I don't have to write a bunch of comments, or even worse, not write a bunch of comments and have people just looking at it, not really understanding what's happening. So breaking this down into a couple of steps will make it hopefully a little more obvious what's going on here. First, I'm breaking these elements out of the arguments, and then I'm going to use the map array function, array method, and map through them and create a new array, transforming each value. And now I need to think about how I want to transform it. The way map works is you pass in a callback, and it's going to iterate through the array you've called it on. And whatever callback you give map, it's going to call that on each value. Whatever that callback returns for that value is going to be the value in the new array at that position. So the first thing we're going to do is name a parameter, because map is going to pass in the value. So it's going to pass in the value in the array we're calling map on. So the value in this case is going to be a single number string. And I'm going to do an arrow function. And now what I want to return out of that is I'm going to parse that string into a number, and I'll use parse int. I'm assuming it's going to be a whole number. I may be wrong on that, but we'll see. Okay, and parse int, as code is helpfully telling us here, takes first a string, which is the number to be converted, and then a radix. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And the radix, actually, let me get to that, and then hopefully it'll explain it to us. The number we're going to be parsing, or the number string, is number string. And now we're at the radix, which is a value between 2 and 36 that specifies the base of the number in numstring. That means what number system basically are we converting this to? We want to convert this to a decimal number, a base 10 number. So the base is 10. Number systems are kind of a big topic. I'm not going to cover them here. You're probably familiar with binary, which is a base 2 system. That means there are 2 different values, 0 and 1. You might be familiar with hexadecimal if you've already done some work with CSS. You know that colors are represented by a hexadecimal value, and those numbers are represented by 16 values, 0 through F, I think. Yeah, 0 through F. The numbering system we're most familiar with is base 10, and that's just the numbers we work with every day. 10 values, 0 through 9 for each place. So here's what's going to happen. Map is going to take the first value in number strings, whatever it is. Let's imagine it is a 1, but it's going to be a string containing the numeral 1. It's going to call this callback, and it's going to pass in that value as the first parameter. So it'll be number string for the duration of this callback function. So number string will become 1 on the first iteration of the map. What it will do is it will return parse int. It'll pass in a string 1, and it will parse it to a decimal or a base 10 number. It's going to take a string that is 1, and it's going to convert it to a number that is 1. And that's going to be what's going to be spit out the other side. Map will keep doing that until it's through every value in number strings, and numbers will become that new array. Hopefully that made some sense. Now we've got the numbers we're going to be working with. We just need to sum them. You could do this all sorts of different ways. I like to use reduce, even though I think it's kind of hard to remember, but it's a pretty clean way to do it. But you don't have to. You could use a for loop. You could loop through every value in numbers and just add them together and then log out the resulting value. Let me check and make sure that is what we're supposed to be doing, is logging out. Yeah, print the sum to the console. So that's what it wants. It wants the number logged out. I am going to use reduce and just show you how to do it that way. We're going to call this variable sum. We're going to call reduce on the numbers array. Reduce, I think, is fairly confusing to use. I almost always have to refer to MDN to remember what I need to do. I know it takes a callback, and the callback takes previous value, current index, array. This is a case where I think I could kind of fumble through this, but I really want to see an example. I'm looking for reduce. Here we go. I'm kind of scanning through this because I sort of know what I'm looking for. I just want to see an example. Okay, yeah. Accumulator, current value, current index, array, and then you return, whatever you return here becomes the new value of the accumulator for the next iteration. Cool. Let's try to implement that. We'll call our parameter accumulator. Actually, we could just call it sum, since that's what it is. The current value, I guess we could just call it number. And then I'm not going to do anything with the current index or the entire array. I don't really need those. So I'm just not going to name those parameters. They'll still get passed in, but since we don't need them, we don't need to name them anything. What do I want to do? I want to, oh, actually, I don't even need multiple lines for this. This can just be a one-liner. If you do a one-line arrow function like this without the curly braces, it will automatically return whatever your expression is. So like back here on line 2, when we did parse int and passed in the number string and then 10, it'll just return that value. You don't have to explicitly say return. If you add the curly braces, then you'd have to say return if you want something to be returned. Here we are going to return sum plus number. It's pretty straightforward. Now the last thing to do is just to print out, using console log, the sum. I think that should be good. Let's go over here and run it. I'll just run it through Node first. Oh, that didn't work. Reduce of empty array with no initial value. Okay, why would numbers be empty? Oh, I know why. I didn't pass anything in. We have to pass some values. Okay, cool. That looks good. 6. I passed in 1, 2, and 3. The sum of those is 6. Let's add a couple more, and that should be 15. Yep, looks good. Now let's try with just 2. Should work, but yeah, that looks good. Now let's get it to verify. Looks like we passed. The test it ran wanted to see 278, and we logged out 278, so we passed. Excellent. We are rolling right along. My first I/O, let's see what that is. Create a file named my-first.io.js. Write a program that uses a single synchronous file system operation to read a file and print the number of new lines it contains to the console. The full path to the file to read will be provided as the first command line argument. You do not need to make your own test file. Okay, let's look at the hints. To perform a file system operation, you're going to need the fs module from the Node core library. To load this kind of module or any other global module, use the following incantation. I like calling that an incantation. Now you have the full fs module available in a variable named fs. All synchronous file system methods in the fs module end with sync. To read a file, you'll need to use fs.readFileSync and then pass in the path to the file as a string. This method will return a buffer object containing the complete contents of the file. This tells us where the documentation is for fs, in case we need to reference that. That could be useful. This tells us how we can deal with buffer objects, which is probably something we're not accustomed to, and how to convert them into strings, which is something that will be a lot easier to deal with. And an easy way to count the number of new lines. Recall that a JavaScript string can be split into an array of substrings, and that \n can be used as a delimiter. Note that the test file does not have a new line character at the end of the last line, so using this method you'll end up with an array that has one more element than the number of new lines. That makes sense? We're not actually counting the number of lines, we're counting the splits between lines. Okay, let's give this a shot. I'm just going to copy the name here so I don't have to type it. Another new file, Command N, and I'll go ahead and save it so I can name it, paste that name in. Great. I know it said I'm going to need the fs module, and you get that like this. Okay. Good there. Let's reference this documentation they've given us. Oh, do that in the browser. And I'm just going to copy and paste that here. Yeah, this is just the Node documentation. They've given us a local copy of it here, but if I just go to node.js.org and go to docs, I can click on this one. That's the version I'm running. If you're running 13, you can go to that, or you can look for an older version of the docs. And then I can just go here to File System. And this is the same thing we were looking at before, basically. Mine actually may be a little bit newer than what we were looking at before. I'm not sure. Anyway. These are all of the methods and various classes that are provided by this module. And I know it said we would need to use read file sync, so let's find that one. That one's here. And here's the documentation on that function. We call it this way, fs.readFileSync. We have to pass it a path, and that path can be a string, a buffer, a URL, or an integer. We know we're going to get the full path as a string, so we'll be passing a string. And then you pass options, and they're optional, which is what the square brackets mean. Options is an object, and it looks like it has two different keys you can pass. You can pass an encoding, and you can pass a flag. Okay, this is interesting. And this is something we wouldn't have learned without reading the documentation. If the encoding option, oh, I'm going to bump this font up so you can read this too. Okay, here we are, read file sync. If the encoding option is specified, then this function returns a string. Otherwise, it returns a buffer. So it returns a buffer by default, but we can pass in an encoding option to get it to return a string. I don't know exactly what that needs to be, but here's something else. For detailed information, see the documentation of the asynchronous version of this API. This is the same function, but it's asynchronous instead of synchronous. Okay, so here is some more detailed information, and this will all work for read file sync too. The only difference is read file sync does not need a callback, because that's only needed for an asynchronous function, not a synchronous function. If option is a string, then it specifies the encoding. That means we could pass options as an object and then have an encoding key and give it an encoding, or we could just pass a string that is the encoding key and the function will know what to do with that. I wonder if this UTF-8 will work for our purposes. I don't know what encoding we want to use to get a string, but maybe that one is worth a shot. We've got FS, and now I've completely forgotten everything we're doing, so let's go back here. Print the number of new lines to standard out. The full path to the file will be provided as the first command line argument. Okay, so that's, and they're helpfully giving us exactly how we will reference that particular argument. So we'll just grab that from them. I'm just going to call this, I'm going to call this file path. The reason I'm doing that is because there is a part of the module of the standard Node library called path, and so it's conventionally imported as path. It's given the variable name path, so I don't want to take that in case we need to bring that one in as well. Or it might cause somebody confusion if they're used to reading Node code and they read this and see path. So we'll call this file path. And what we want to do to that is we want to read in the contents. So I'm going to create another variable, file contents, and that is going to be fs.readFileSync. And then we're going to pass the path. And I'm just going to try passing in the options. And I know we can pass in just a string. We'll try UTF-8. And hopefully what this will do is this will just read the file in and give us a string instead of a buffer, since that's what we're going to have anyway in order to count the number of new lines. Before I go too far with this, I could just test this piece, although I need a file to read. Let's create a file. I'm just going to say, let's save this. Okay, test.txt. We'll just do that. Okay, I've got a file we can load to test this. We'll have to pass the path of that file as a command line argument when we run it, and I'll show you how to do that. And the test I want to see what this file contents actually contains, if it contains a string like we hope. So I'm going to log out whatever that is. Here's how I'm going to run it to test. I'll start with Node, and this is called what? My First IO. myfirstio.js, and it needs an argument that is our text file, test.txt. I don't need to give it the full path because it's in the same directory, so it should use a relative path. Let's try it. That's what I thought it should do. That's the contents of the file, and that's just a string. Now, to see what that UTF actually did, or if it did do what we think it did, I'm going to remove it and see what is in that same variable now. Now, I expect it will be a buffer, so I'm not sure what will get logged out. I don't think it'll be anything we can read or make any sense of. I'm just going to run the same thing. Yeah, so this is just logging out like a string representation of that buffer. That's good news, because that means passing in the UTF-8 encoding did appear to do what we wanted it to do. This is not the actual script we want to write. That was just to see where we were, to see if we were making progress. And what are we actually trying to log out? The number of new lines. Okay. And what was that hint about the total number of splits? If we use split, we'll end up with an array that has one more element than the number of new lines. Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, so if we split on the new line, it's going to create an element in the array everywhere. It's going to split everywhere there's a new line, and the array is going to be made of those elements on either side of the new line. So we're going to have one more than we have new lines. Let's go ahead and do the split. We'll just call this lines, because that's what the split is going to produce. It's going to produce an array of lines. We'll start with the file contents. We'll split, and we're going to split on this, which is the new line character. And now we need to know the new lines count, which is going to be lines.length, and I've already forgotten again, -1. That's one too many. Now I can log that. I think that should do everything we need to do. Let's test it. Oh, I forgot my dot in console log. That should do everything we need. I don't have a great way to test this interactively because they're going to feed me their own file. So I'm just going to use their verify script to test. learn new node, verify, and then my first IO. Okay, let's scroll up. Cool. It looks like we're good here. They ran 2 tests here. They checked to see if the submission results matched the expected, and also if we used the correct synchronous method, read file sync. And we passed both. They were looking for a 23, so whatever file they passed in had 23 new lines, and that's what we counted. Looks like we're good. Here's their official result. You can see theirs is much more compact than mine is. And I could have made mine more compact, but like I said, I like to draw things out a little bit more and sort of add some lines that give me some documentation without having to write explicit comments. But yeah, they sort of just broke this down into a couple of lines. They didn't use my trick to get it to a string of passing the encoding, but doesn't matter. The result's the same. Let's move on to the next one. My first async IO. Okay. Create a file named myfirstasyncio.js. Write a program that uses a single asynchronous file system operation to read a file and print the number of new lines it contains to the console. The full path to the file to read will be provided as the first command line argument. It sounds like exactly the same script as last time, but with the asynchronous method. And that's basically what they're telling us here in the hints. Instead of using the return value of this method, you will need to collect the value from a callback function that you pass in as the second argument. And then here they have a link you can go to learn more about callback functions. What a callback function is it is a function you pass in to another function or method, and it gets called later after some work has been done. With these asynchronous methods or asynchronous functions, you don't really know that they're going to be done by the time you run the next line of code. Node will start them running, and they'll go start doing their thing, and then your next line will also start executing. So if you're trying to do something that depends on that previous async function being done, you may not be there. You probably aren't, and it probably won't work. So you have to do all that stuff that depends on something being done in the callback function you pass in. It's a little bit weird the first time you do it, but we'll go through it together. Since this one's so similar, I'm just going to save a copy of this script. I'm going to do Command-Shift-S. Just name this file again. I know that this is going to be read file instead of read file sync. Now, this call is where things get different. I'm going to have to pass in a third value, and this is going to be my function. Node uses a convention with its callback functions, and that's what we're telling us about here. All of these methods that come with the core Node modules, when they call the callback, the first value they pass in is an error, if there is one. And then the second one is whatever data is coming out of the operation. So we want to make sure that our callback function consumes that. And here's another point. Since we're not getting the return value out of this call, we're not really doing anything for ourselves by assigning it to this value. So I'm just going to call it. And instead of calling this data, that's a little too generic, I'm going to call that file contents, because that's literally what will be coming out of it. Now I've got a callback. I could leave it like this, but it will not work because this file contents variable for one, doesn't even exist in this context. We haven't created it. We haven't done anything to create this variable in this context. It will exist here as a parameter or as an argument that's passed in to this callback function, but it doesn't exist down here. You might think, okay, well, let's say let file contents up here, and then inside the callback, we'll just set, we'll change this back to data so we don't have collisions. And now we're going to set file contents equal to data. And now we should be good. But this won't actually work. And here's why. Because by the time we get here to line 9 and start executing this code, this line 7 will not have happened yet. This read file operation will still be running, and so this callback will not have been called. So file contents will be undefined. So it's going to try to call split on undefined, and that's going to create an exception because undefined doesn't have a split method. Only arrays have that. Here is what we do instead. I'm going to undo all of these changes. Okay. Now we're back. Instead, I'm just going to take these lines and I'm going to bring them up here, and this should work. Now we're not trying to do anything with file contents until the callback function. So we know file contents will be set at that point. Let's see if it verifies. Looks like we are good. This one expected to get 22. We gave it 22. Everything's good. Now here's their official solution. Let's take a look at that. Yep. This stuff just looks the same basically. fs.read file. There is the file path. And then here's their callback function they're passing in. They are not passing the encoding, so they'll have to manually convert the buffer to a string, which they do right here. Oh, they also have error handling, and we don't have that. I made a bad assumption that there weren't going to be any errors. That turned out to be right, but you should never assume that. So the sort of customary thing to do is to first check this error parameter inside your callback function and see if it contains anything. Otherwise, it'll be null. But if it does contain something, then you probably need to do something with it or return out of your callback because you're not going to get the data you expected. But aside from that, their solution looks pretty similar. They're taking contents, they're splitting it on the new line, grabbing the length and subtracting 1, and then logging that out. We'll stop there for now. I'll be back in the coming weeks to continue working on these tutorial exercises. In the meantime, I'd like you to try to push ahead on your own and see if you can apply what you've learned here and maybe learn a few more things and put those together and complete some of the upcoming exercises. While you're here, if you came up with a different method to solve one of the exercises in this video, post that in the comments below. I learn a lot by seeing how other people approach problems differently, and I'd like everybody watching this video to be able to read through the comments and have that same experience. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll talk to you soon.